The briefing had already started when I walked in. Nobody saved me a seat. That was fine, I was used to standing. I had been standing at the edge of Concordat meetings for 3 years, holding a coffee mug with the Earth Defense Force insignia on it, watching species with 12,000-year histories make decisions about a galaxy they assumed they understood completely. I stood near the back wall of the observation deck and watched Admiral Soth of the Valthari address the full Concordat assembly on the main hollow screen, his 7 limbs folded in that particular arrangement that meant he was being patient with people he considered slow. I ate a protein bar. The Valthari had a word for humans. It translated, depending on who you asked, as either the loud children or the new noise. Soth used it in his address twice in the first 4 minutes. He was not trying to be insulting. That was simply the category. 40 years of Concordat membership and humanity had been filed under a heading that other species used when they meant something that was present but not relevant. Our file in the Concordat Intelligence Registry was 43 pages. 43 pages for 8 billion people across 4 colony worlds and 1 battered home planet that had spent 4 centuries fighting everything the universe threw at it and surviving through means that were, depending on your perspective, either impressive or deeply alarming. Cathar 4, a species of amber-skinned beings with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond across their broad faces, had a 400-page file. The Marin Collective, who communicated through color shifts in their skin and had never once in recorded history started a war, had 280 pages. The Arath, the hive species currently expanding from the galactic rim at a rate that should have been setting off every alarm in every intelligence office across the Concordat, had 612 pages. We had 43. Half of it was about our music. As Soth was explaining in his measured and civilized way that the Arath expansion into the outer Concordat was a concern the assembly would need to address. He used the word concern the way a person uses it when they mean something they plan to schedule into a future meeting. He proposed 12 more years of diplomatic engagement. He cited 3 previous instances where patient negotiation had resolved border disputes. I pulled out my tablet. I opened a file I had been updating for 2 years. It was not an official document. No one had asked me to write it. I had written it the same way humans write everything that matters, because the alternative was not writing it, and not writing it meant pretending the pattern did not exist, and I had never been able to pretend that. The file was titled Arath Behavioral Modeling Asymmetric Threat Response Framework. It was 219 pages long. I had started it on a Tuesday night in my quarters with a cup of cold coffee and a growing feeling in my chest that felt like watching someone walk toward a step they could not see. The Arath did not negotiate. That was the core finding, buried in observable data that anyone could access if they bothered to look. Every species, though Arath had contacted over the past 60 years had gone through the same sequence: first trade discussions, then border agreements, then a period of apparent cooperation, then the communication infrastructure of the contacted species began experiencing interference, small disruptions, explainable disruptions, the kind that get filed under technical anomalies and reviewed in quarterly reports. Then the swarm arrived. 3 member worlds had already fallen. Tevez Orn, Cathar Outlier 9 in the Marin observation posted station rail. 6 weeks, the Concordat had responded. With a task force, the task force had performed beautifully by every metric. The Concordat used to measure performance, it had also accomplished nothing because the Concordat was measuring the wrong things. I was not on the agenda for this meeting. I was, as far as the assembly was concerned, the human standing in the back with a coffee mug. As Soth finished his address, the assembly moved to the response committee's recommendations. I read my file again, not because I did not know it, but because I needed something to do with my hands while I listened to 12 civilized species discuss a measured and coordinated response to something that did not operate on measured and coordinated terms. 12 more years. I thought about the colonies we had lost before humanity figured out what we were dealing with on Proxima Station. I thought about the 9 months of reports that nobody acted on. I thought about the faces of the people who had been in those reports reduced to statistics in a document that sat in a cabinet for 11 months before anyone opened it. The assembly voted in favor of continued diplomatic engagement. I finished my protein bar. The wrapper made a small noise when I folded it. The Cathar 4 delegate in me turned one of his 4 eyes in my direction. I held his gaze. He looked away first. After the session ended, I went back to my quarters and opened a new document. I titled it Submission Request Arath. Threat Assessment Earth Defense Force. Analysis Priority Urgent. It was the 17th time I had filed a submission request. The first 16 were in a folder on my tablet. I kept them because I believed in records. I believed in the specific kind of record that shows without commentary, without anger, without any decoration at all, exactly what happened, and exactly when it happened, and exactly who was in the room. I sent the request. Then I made another coffee, sat in the chair by the small porthole in my quarters, and watched the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and permanent and completely uninterested in the things we did in the dark between them. My name is Yale Osimensa. I am 34 years old. I am the Earth Defense Force liaison officer aboard the Concordat, diplomatic vessel S. Soth commands. I hold the rank of commander, which in Concordat terms places me roughly equivalent to a mid-level administrator. I grew up on the Kepler 442 colony. We called it the Dry Rock. It had 2 seasons, one where the dust storms came from the east and one where they came from the west. My mother worked fuel systems. My father taught mathematics in a prefab school building that lost its roof twice before I turned 10. I learned early that the universe does not give you warnings in a format you are ready to receive. It gives you data. What you do with the data is entirely your problem. I had been giving the Concordat data for 3 years. They had been filing it under footnote Species Low Threat Assessment. The morning after the assembly vote, I received the automated response to my submission. Thank you for your contribution. Your document has been received and will be reviewed in the next available assessment cycle. The next available assessment cycle was in 4 months. I put the tablet down. I looked at the ceiling. I picked the tablet back up, opened my 219-page file, and began converting it into a format that could be broadcast on The Concordat's emergency intelligence channel, which I was technically not authorized to access. I was authorized to observe. I was authorized to attend sessions when invited. I was authorized to submit documents through proper channels. I was not authorized for much else. But there was a specific clause in the Concordat Emergency Protocols, Section 14 subsection C, that allowed any member species officer to flag a document as emergency intelligence if the officer could demonstrate that the threat assessment contained information not present in current Concordat modeling. My document contained 219 pages of exactly that. I read the clause 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly, then I read it a 4th time because I wanted to be certain I was not making a mistake. Born out of frustration, I was not making a mistake. I flagged the document. Then I sat back in my chair and thought about how the next 48 hours were going to go and how Soth was going to stand very, very still when he read it, and how the galaxy was about to discover what humanity had been doing for 40 years, while everyone was busy not watching. I ate another protein bar. Outside the porthole, the stars were still there. They did not look any different. They never did right before everything changed. The emergency channel flag triggered at 3:40 station time, which meant that by 600, 3 senior Concordat intelligence officers had read the executive summary, and by 800, SSOVTH had summoned me. Not invited, summoned. The difference mattered. An invitation meant a scheduled slot. His calendar. A summons meant someone had walked to my quarters and knocked on the door at 7:45. While I was halfway through a cup of coffee that had not yet finished cooling, I brought the coffee. SSOVTH's command office occupied the forward section of the ship's command level. The walls were Velthari formal, smooth, white material that absorbed sound. Nothing on them except a single navigational map that updated in real time. He was standing when I entered, all 7 limbs arranged in the configuration I had learned to read as controlled discomfort, which for a Velthari was essentially the equivalent of packing. He did not speak immediately. That was also a Velthari thing. They used silence as punctuation. I stood in front of his desk and drank my coffee. He finally looked at me directly, which, among his species, was a gesture of significant attention, and said, "This document, the analytical framework. Section 9, your species developed this during the Concordat's 9th expansion." "Yes," I said. At that time, Earth's combined fleet was 6 warships. 7, the 7th was held together with a repair compound we developed ourselves because the Concordat supplier's pricing was outside our quarterly budget. He was very still. "You had 7 warships and you were building threat response frameworks for a species you had not yet encountered in direct conflict. We had sensor data, we had behavioral patterns from the species the Irath had previously contacted, we had a research team on Kepler station, and a lot of time on our hands." He picked up my tablet, which was displaying page 47 of the document. He looked at it for a long moment. His secondary limbs, the smaller 2 on his lower left, made a slight adjustment. The Velthari equivalent of a deep breath. Why was this not presented to the Concordat Intelligence Assembly? I put my coffee mug down on his desk. Not hard, just down. It was submitted 16 times through standard channels, I said. The first submission was 8 years ago during the Erath's initial contact with the Tevasoran border. The last submission was last night. I have the response logs on the same tablet you are holding. They are in the folder labeled I reached over and tapped the screen, filed low priority. He looked at the folder. He was very still in a way that was different from his previous stillness. The first stillness had been formal. This one was something else. You continued submitting, he said. 16 times, yes. Knowing the submissions were not being reviewed. Knowing they were being filed, there is a difference. Filed means the record exists. I believe in records. He set the tablet down. He looked at me with all three of his primary eyes, which was the most direct form of attention a Velthari could give another being. Commander Osimansa, he said, why did you not escalate through alternative channels before now? I had thought about how to answer this question for 3 years. I had turned it over in quiet moments in the observation deck in my quarters, on every long night when I had read the same data and seen the same pattern and submitted the same requests and received the same polite automated acknowledgments. You never asked, I said. That was all 3 words. I did not add anything to them. I let them sit in the room and do what they were meant to do. SSOVTH was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I am asking now. And that was how it started, not with a ceremony, not with a formal elevation of humanity's status in the Concordat hierarchy. It started with a Velthari admiral standing very still in a white room, holding a tablet with 219 pages that his intelligence division had filed under low priority for 8 years, asking a human woman with a cooling cup of coffee to tell him what she knew. I told him. I talked for 4 hours. I walked him through the behavioral modeling, the communication infrastructure analysis, the load-bearing psychological assumption at the center of Erath swarm, coordination, the specific sequence of events that preceded every world they had taken, and the 17-week window that still existed barely, narrowing daily, in which the Concordat could interrupt that sequence rather than respond to its conclusion. He called in 2 of his senior staff at the 2-hour mark, then 3 more at the 3-hour mark. By the time I finished, there were 11 Concordat officers in the room, representing 5 different species, all of them looking at my data with expressions that I had learned to translate across the species barrier into one common meaning. The Cathar general's secondary eyes opened wide, all 4 of them. That was his version of, oh no. The communication interference at relay Junction 7, said one of the mare officers, her skin shifting toward a deep alarmed blue. We classified that as a technical anomaly 6 weeks ago. It is not a technical anomaly, I said. It is step 4. Step 5 is a coordinated strike on your deprane sensor. Step 6 is when the swarm arrives and you are operating blind. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of a meeting, the other kind, the kind that happens when a group of intelligent beings is rapidly reorganizing everything they thought they understood. SSOVTH turned to me. What do we do? And there it was, the question I had been waiting 3 years to be asked. The question that every one of those 16 filed submissions had been building toward the question that, if it had been asked 8 years ago, would have meant that 3 Concordat worlds would still have their people in them. I felt something move through me that was not triumph. It was not relief either. It was a tiredness without a name, and underneath it something quieter, the specific steadiness that comes from doing a hard thing for a long time, without recognition, and continuing to do it anyway, and being right in a way that costs too much to feel good about. The Erath's entire swarm coordination model depends on one assumption, I said. They have never encountered a species that fights effectively without real-time communication. Every species they have engaged retreats into confusion when their signals are jammed. The Erath use that confusion the way a predator uses a net. I pulled up the tactical display on my tablet and turned it so the room could see. We give them the confusion they expect, and then we use it against them. The Marin officer leaned forward, the Cathar general's 4 eyes tracked across my display with the focused attention of someone rapidly building a new picture of a situation they had thought they understood. I walked them through the framework: decentralized command structure, pre-assigned autonomous protocols for every unit, activated the moment communication was jammed, requiring no real-time instruction, a response pattern so distributed and so redundant that there was nothing central to disable. This requires training, said the Cathar general, months of it. 11 weeks, I said, if we start today. Which is also exactly how long the 17-week window has left in it. The room went quiet again. SSOVTH looked at me for a long time. Earth developed these autonomous protocols, he said. You have practiced them since the Proxima Station incident. That was 22 years ago. We have been running exercises twice a year since. Then I picked up my coffee. It was cold. We had a lot of time. Nobody was watching. SSOVTH straightened to his full height. Among Velthari, that was a gesture that meant a decision had been made. I will convene an emergency session of the Security Council, he said. I will present your analysis. I will recommend that Earth Defense Force tactical methodology be adopted as the Concordat's emergency response framework. He paused. I will also be requesting that your document be reclassified, all 16 submissions. All 17, I said. The last one went out last night. He tilted his head in the way that meant acknowledged. I picked up my tablet from his desk. I picked up my coffee mug. I walked to the door and then I stopped because there was one more thing that needed to be said, and I had learned a long time ago that the things that need to be said do not get easier if you walk away from them. Admiral, I said, the 3 worlds we lost, Tevis Orn, Keth Outlier 9. Station Rel. I did not turn around. The data that would have prevented that was in your intelligence files. It was there before the first world fell. I let that sit. Then I walked out. Behind me, the room was very quiet. I had 3 hours between SS Ovitz emergency council session and the operational briefing I had been asked to lead, and I spent them in the small galley off the officers' quarters, eating a meal that tasted like reconstituted grain and going over the briefing structure. One more time. The galley was empty except for a junior Keth 4 officer named Addo who brought me a second serving without being asked and then sat down across from me, which was unusual. Keth 4 did not sit uninvited. You are the human who filed the document, he said, not a question. Commander Osimensa, I said, yes. He looked at me with all four eyes, which at his rank was probably not regulation, but he was young enough that he had not yet learned to be careful with his expressions. My home world is Keth Outlier 9. I put my fork down. He had a way of sitting very still that I recognized it was not species behavior, it was the specific stillness of a person carrying something too heavy to put down. I am sorry, I said. He nodded once. Your document would have. Yes. He was quiet. I let him be quiet. There was nothing to add to that. Yes, it was the most honest sentence I knew how to say. After a moment he picked up his own food and started eating, and we sat in the galley together without speaking. Two people from different species on opposite sides of a loss that shared the same shape. I thought about that a lot later, how grief has the same weight regardless of how many eyes you have. The operational briefing was held in the main tactical room, which was the largest meeting space on the ship and was still not quite large enough for the 14 officers and 3 holographic projections that had been crammed into it. I recognized faces from 5 species. The Keth 4 general, whose name was Verk, was in the front row, his 4 eyes alert and unreadable. 2 Marin senior officers sat in the second row, their skin a careful neutral gray. A Velthari commander I had not met before stood at the side, perfectly still, observing rather than participating, which was a Velthari method of initial assessment. Nobody had brought me a seat again. I stood at the head of the room with my tablet and a portable display board that I had brought from my quarters. It was a physical board, white surface, and markers, the kind that humans had been using for briefings for 150 years. Several of the officers looked at it the way you look at something that belongs to a different era. I uncapped the marker. They are not coming for your planets. First, I said, there was no preamble, no introduction. I had learned that openings which built slowly lost the room before they reached the point. They are coming for your communication infrastructure. You are not in a war. You are in a surgical procedure, and they have been operating for 6 weeks. General Verk's secondary eyes opened. I drew the Ereth expansion pattern on the board, concentric rings with the 3 fallen worlds marked in red and the communication relay junctions marked with small circles. I connected them. The pattern was obvious once you saw it. Half the room leaned forward. Every world the Erath have taken followed this sequence, I said, and I walked them through it. Contact, apparent cooperation, communication, disruption, signal blackout, arrival of the swarm. I showed them the timeline. I showed them where relay junction 7's anomaly fit into that timeline. I showed them the 5 additional relay junctions that were currently showing early state interference patterns consistent with Step 3. The Marin officer's skin shifted. The traditional Concordat response to this threat, I continued, is centralized command, coordinated signal networks, and rapid unified response. That is exactly what the Erath are designed to defeat. When your signals are jammed, your command structure loses cohesion. Your units wait for Instruction, the waiting is the vulnerability. I drew a second diagram, decentralized. Nodes, each operating independently, each carrying a complete set of pre-authorized response protocols that activated without a central command. Signal. This is the framework Earth Defense Force has been using for 22 years. It was designed for exactly this scenario. Each unit operates as a complete tactical entity. The swarm expects confusion when communication fails. We give them action instead. Verk said the training requirement for this 11 weeks, I said, if we begin immediately, each unit needs to memorize and practice the autonomous protocol sequence until it runs without instruction. It is not complicated. It is repetitive. That is the point. You have officers who can train hours, said the Velthari commander from the side of the room. It was the first thing he had said. He was watching me with the focused stillness of his species. Yes, Earth has 8 training officers. On the vessel, we have the full protocol library. We can begin today. The room shifted in the way rooms shift. When a group of people stops measuring a situation and starts moving into it. Verk looked at me for a moment. You came to this briefing prepared for us to accept your framework. I came prepared for every outcome, I said. Being prepared for a refusal does not mean expecting it. He made a sound that his translator rendered as something between a word and a breath. Among Kethfor, I had learned it meant something close to fair enough. The briefing ran for 3 hours. By the end of it, the 11 weeks had a structure. Training assignments were distributed. The Concordat's 7 remaining border units were mapped to the decentralized protocol. Relay Junction 7's defense posture was adjusted. When the officers filed out, Verk stopped beside me. He looked at the display board. The marker, he said, is there a reason for the physical board? Force of habit, I said, and it does not require a signal connection to function. He looked at me. That is either a very human joke, he said, or a very human point. Both, I said. We find it more efficient that way. He left. I capped the marker and slid it into my jacket pocket. The protein bar wrapper from breakfast was already in there. I added the marker. The room was empty. Now the holographic display still running, the tactical map of the Concordat border hanging in the air. Above the table, the 5 circles I had drawn around the compromised relay junctions blinked with quiet regularity like a pulse. 11 weeks. That was what we had. I looked at the map for a long moment, and then I turned the displays off and I had always been better at the second one. The Kethnara way station looked on the tactical display like a small gray rectangle surrounded by a great deal of empty space. That was the thing about way station sieges. They did not look like much from a distance. The distance was dishonest about the weight of what was happening there. I had been awake for 31 hours. That was not unusual. I had been awake for longer during the Proxima simulations. The body learns its own kind of math when the situation demands it. You take the fatigue and you put it somewhere interior and you leave it there until the work is done. Bringing it out before then does not help anyone. The station was the load-bearing point. I had known that since I built the original analysis, everything else in the Concordat's response campaign had been preparation for this moment. 11 Weeks of training, 7 border units. Operating on the new decentralized protocol, 3 successful interruptions of Erath advance movements that had bought us time and, more importantly, had proven to every Concordat commander in the field that the framework worked. They believed it now in a way they had not believed it when it was diagrams on a whiteboard. Belief earned in practice is a different thing from belief earned by argument. I had been making the argument for years. The practice was new. The practice had changed the room in ways the argument never fully managed. My command post was aboard the Velthari cruiser Ironon, which served as the campaign central coordination vessel, and was also, when communication was active, the loudest ship I had ever had. The displeasure of working in Cathar 4 Marin Velthari and human officers working in the same room created a kind of ambient noise that was part language, part translated frequency, part the specific human habit of thinking out loud. I had learned to work through it. Verk was at the adjacent station, managing the eastern flank. We had developed over 11 weeks of working shorthand that did not require full sentences. He would state a position. I would adjust the line. He would confirm. The translation delay between us had been cut to approximately 2 seconds, which in tactical terms was the difference between useful and useless. The plan was straightforward, which was intentional. Simple plans fail in comprehensible ways. Complicated plans fail in ways you did not see coming. We were going to take the station in 3 movements. The first movement would draw the Erath defense toward the station's southern approach using a decoy formation. The second movement would bring the eastern flank through the communication dead zone on the station's northern side, where our signal would be jammed, but where our preset protocols would keep the units operating without instruction. The third movement was the breach. The Erath would expect the second movement to dissolve into confusion when the jamming hit. It would not dissolve. That was the whole plan in essence. Do the thing they have never seen a species do: operate in the silence, keep moving. In the dark, we went to signal blackout at 1400 hours. I watched the display. The eastern flank disappeared from the communication grid, which meant they had entered the jamming zone, which meant they were now operating entirely on protocol, entirely without instruction from me or anyone else. The room got quieter. Not silence, but the specific reduction that happens when people who have been talking stop because there is nothing left to say, because the thing is now in motion and words are no longer part of it. I watched the display. At 1447, the Erath defense movement shifted south exactly as modeled. They were repositioning for the decoy formation. They were doing what they always did when they sensed incoming centralized response. They were building the net. At 1503, the eastern flank reappeared on the station's northern sensor range. Still in formation. Still moving. Still coherent. I heard Verk make a sound beside me, not translated, just a sound. I did not look at him. I was watching the display. The Erath defense movement stalled. That was visible even in the abstract geometry of the tactical map. The southern repositioning slowed. The formation logic fractured slightly, which in Erath terms was significant, because Erath formations did not fracture. The swarm mind maintained cohesion through absolute confidence in its model. of how the enemy would behave. The model was wrong. At 15:21, the breach team entered the station. I was watching the ship status indicators on the secondary display when the Dakar's light went amber. It was a small indicator, a rectangle, the size of my thumbnail in the lower right section of the secondary display. Amber meant critical damage. I knew what came after amber. The Dakar was the second of our 3 human destroyers. It carried a crew of 41. The indicator shifted to red at 15:24. The room around me kept moving, officers calling positions, translators running, Verk adjusting the eastern flank by 2 degrees to compensate for the gap the Dakar had been covering. The campaign continued because campaigns continue. That is the weight of command. The machine does not stop when a part of it breaks. I adjusted the western coverage line by 4 degrees. I redistributed the flank. I kept talking through the adjustments because my voice was one of the inputs the room needed, and the room needed to keep functioning. I did not look at the Dakar's indicator again. I did not need to. The number was in me. Now it would stay there in the way. Numbers like that always stayed. You do not forget them. You learn to carry them without letting them steer. At 16:08, the Cathar station was secured. The Arath formation dissolved in the eastern sector first, then the southern, and then in the way that things dissolve when the load-bearing assumption underneath them fails, the broader swarm coordination began to fragment. The hive mind had operated for as long as any species had been observing it on the principle that signal blackout equals paralysis. That principle had just been disproven at a station that every Concordat tactical model had flagged as too costly to retake. The fragmentation spread faster than our projections had expected. It spread because the Arath had no secondary model. They had never needed one. No species had ever made them need one. Until now. The campaign did not end at 16:08. There were 3 more weeks of engagement, smaller actions, mopping operations, 2 more relay junctions recovered and secured, but the central mechanism of the Arath expansion strategy was broken. A machine does not stop immediately when you remove its engine, but it stops later, after the tactical room had quieted and the officers from 5 species had done the things people do after something is over: sitting, breathing, the particular stillness of bodies that have been running hard. Verk came and stood beside me. He looked at the display where the Dakar's status was now listed in the campaign record. How, he said. He did not complete the question. He did not need to. I had been asked versions of it before in different ways by different people. How do humans keep moving when the loss is immediate and visible? How do you separate the knowledge of what you lost from the requirement to continue? Because stopping does not bring them back, I said. I looked at the indicator for a moment, longer than I needed to. We learned that one early. He did not ask anything else. I was glad of that. The protein bar wrapper in my pocket was from this morning. I had 4 more in my kit. It was a small and completely irrelevant fact, and I thought about it with great focus for approximately 30 seconds, which was the amount of time it took for the steadiness to come back fully. Then I went back to work. The Concordat Security Council chamber was the most architecturally serious room I had ever stood in. The ceiling was 40 ft high and made of a translucent material that showed the stars above the ship. The table was Velthari construction, single piece of material pulled from a volcanic formation on the Velthari home world, 11,000 years old, representing a history so long that humanity's entire recorded civilization would fit inside it with room remaining. The seats around it were calibrated to the body configurations of 7 different species, which meant that no seat was perfectly comfortable for any single being, which I had always suspected was intentional. I was standing at the address position. At the head of the table, there were 31 council members present. SS Oveth was among them in the senior Velthari seat. Verk was present as the Cathar 4 representative, his 4 eyes tracking me with an attention that had changed its quality over 11 weeks, from skepticism to something else. The Marin delegate's skin was a formal, attentive gold. There were also, for the first time in 40 years of Concordat membership, 2 additional seats at the table with the Earth Defense Force insignia on the identifier panels. I had not been told about the seats in advance. I had seen them when I walked in. I had looked at them for exactly 1 second and then looked away because the looking had done something to my chest that I did not have time for right then. The council had invited me here to receive Earth's elevation to full Security Council membership. That was the official purpose of the session. There was to be a formal acknowledgement, a vote, a series of procedural steps that the Concordat performed with great seriousness. Before all of that, they had asked me to address the assembly. I had written what I was going to say in my quarters the night before. I had written 3 different versions. The first was gracious, the second was brief, the third was the one I actually planned to deliver, which was neither. I looked at the room, 31 faces, 31 sets of eyes arranged in various configurations, 31 representatives of species that had collectively decided at various points over 40 years that humanity was not worth a full seat at this table. I was not angry. I needed to say that first because what I was about to say might be mistaken for anger, and it was not. Anger was a thing I had burned through years ago. What was left was something cooler and more permanent, the thing that stays after anger finishes. It does not have a common name. I had always thought of it simply as the record. I want to give you a number, I said. 17. The room was quiet. That is the number of times Earth Defense Force submitted threat assessment, strategic analyses, and early warning documents regarding the Ereth expansion to the Concordat Intelligence Assembly. The first submission was made 8 years ago. The last was made 2 days before Admiral S. Soveth read the document that led to this campaign. I paused. The first submission was filed under low priority. The second through the 16th were filed under the same heading. The 17th triggered an emergency flag, which is the only reason any of you read it. The room was very still. I'm not saying this as an accusation. I said I am saying it as a fact, because I believe in facts and because I think facts serve everyone better than the alternative. 8 years of data was available to this council. The tactical framework that broke the Erath's expansion model was developed 22 years ago and has been in Earth's defense files unasked for since then. 3 Concordat worlds fell during the period in which that framework was available and not in use. I let that sit. I'm also not saying this to claim credit. Credit is not what I am after. I have never been after credit. I have been after the outcome. The outcome in this case is that the Eroth expansion has been stopped. The 312 Concordat systems in the projected advance path are not destroyed, and the species sitting in this room are still able to have this conversation. I looked around the table. Earth will accept the council seat. We accept it not because we think we earned it more than other species, but because we intend to use it. We intend to use it in the same way we have used every other resource available to us since we joined this Concordat, to pay attention, to build frameworks, to submit documents, and to make sure that the 17th time is not the first time anyone reads them. I paused one more time. We stopped being angry about how long it took. A long time ago. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when what has been said has landed somewhere deep enough that the response requires a moment to form. That is actually what should concern you. I stopped talking. As Soveth was the first to move, he rose from his seat, which among Velthari carried ceremonial weight, the specific gesture of standing for another in a formal context. Verk rose a second later than the Marin delegate, then one by one the others. I stood at the head of the 11,000-year-old table and looked at 31 beings standing up in a room full of stars and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to a moment like that. I thought about my mother fixing fuel systems on the dry rock. I thought about the prefab school with the roof that kept losing itself to the eastern wind. I thought about the protein bar wrapper in my pocket and the 17 folders on my tablet and the small amber light that had gone red at 1524 over Keth Nara, and the 41 names that lived in that light and would live there permanently. I thought about Adu sitting across from me in the galley carrying Keth Outlier 9. In his stillness, I thought about all the things that had been written down in the dark and filed in the wrong folders for the wrong number of years. After the ceremony, after the procedural votes and the formal acknowledgments, and the translation of the Earth Defense Force insignia into the Council's official record, I went back to the observation deck, the same one I had stood in 3 months ago, eating a protein bar while S. Soveth discussed diplomatic engagement with a species that did not understand the word. I stood at the porthole. Verk found me there an hour later. He stood beside me and looked at the stars for a while without speaking, which I had come to understand was his version of company. The Council has requested, he said, finally, that Earth's complete intelligence archive be integrated into the primary Concordat database. I know, I said. S. Soveth told me. 1,200 pages of active analysis, 40 years of accumulated work. Closer to 1,300 now. We had a productive 3 months. He made the sound that his translator had learned to leave alone because it did not have an equivalent. I had learned it meant something between satisfaction and the specific acknowledgement of something that should have happened sooner. They updated your file, he said. I heard 412 pages. Still only half about the military analysis. I smiled. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been. They Did not know about council seats or 17. Filed submissions or small amber lights. That became red at 1524 over away. Station no tactical model had wanted to touch. They were simply there the way they had always been, massive and indifferent and permanent. The other half, I said, is finally about what we were doing the whole time. No one was watching. Verk was quiet for a moment. What were you doing? He said, not as skepticism, as a genuine question from someone who had spent 3 months learning to read the answer and still wanted to hear it said plainly. I thought about it, about 22 years of autonomous protocol exercises and 17 unanswered submissions and a 219-page document built on late nights and cold coffee and the specific stubbornness of a species that had grown up on a world that kept trying to kill them and had developed as a result an absolute inability to look away from a problem just because no one was asking them to solve it. We were preparing, I said. The stars did not look any different. They never did. But they should have. They should read the other half twice.